was important to my mother during her life, four main themes came out. One was Judaism, the second one was education and knowledge, then her family, and all of the traveling that she did that she enjoyed so much. So I'll say a little bit about each of those. Her Judaism first was absolutely central to her identity. And I remember very vividly, she said to me something, I was probably too young to understand its significance, but she said, you know, I'm a conservative Jew, and you can be conservative when you grow up, or even Orthodox, but I hope you will never be Reformed. In other words, she was allowing drifting to the right of where she was, but she wasn't able to tolerate too much lessening of it. And true to her word, and unlike many parents whose kids become religious, she never discouraged me from my endeavors to become more observant. She was most influenced by Judaism's tenets about the way we relate to our fellow man, things like giving a lot of charity, social justice, opposing anti-Semitism, and for that matter, opposing discrimination against anybody. She said to me more than once that discrimination against any minority is a threat to all minorities. And by the time she met Shira, her dementia was such that she never fully comprehended the notion that we were at first engaged and then married. But I know that she would have been very proud of the fact that Shira's race did not discourage me from marrying her. I remember a time when I was about 8 or 9 years old, and she asked me, what does being Jewish mean to you? That's a heck of a question to ask of somebody that age, and I gave a whole bunch of answers as best I could, and she approved of all of my answers, but somewhere far down the list, I said something like moral right, and she became alive, and she exclaimed, I'm a success as a parent. That really meant more to her than anything else I said. She was the real epitome of the mitzvah of respecting parents. There's not a lot of time to elaborate on all of the things she did to her parents, but suffice it to say that she turned her life practically upside down for many years to comply with the wishes of her elderly mother. In fact, in my opinion, far beyond even the most remote definition of reasonableness. She had an extreme love for Israel. I lost count of how many times my parents went there, but it must be like 12 or 15 times. And she sent Bob and me there for a whole summer to learn about Israel and experience the land when I was 14 years old, at a time when such a thing was not nearly as fashionable as it is today. Now, in terms of the ritual aspects of Judaism, even though they meant less to her, she was still very devoted to them, or at least to her unique versions of what those rituals were that she kept. And she was very firm on keeping those. I'm very thankful to her, in fact, that the basic concepts of keeping Shabbos and keeping kosher were things that I grew up with. And I experienced throughout my childhood the idea that there was one day different from all the other days of the week, and there were certain foods that were permissible and certain foods that weren't. When I became more observant, the only thing I had to change was the details and the extent, but not the basic concepts. They were there. I'll say a little bit about, with a little bit of trepidation, I'll say a little bit about her somewhat paradoxical versions of what she considered these rituals to be. And I want to emphasize that I'm telling these stories as fond and endearing memories of things that made Mom what she was, and not in any way as a criticism of any kind. In fact, in retrospect, I think a lot of these stories are funny. And the ones I'm going to tell about Shabbos, I could tell the same kind of stories about keeping kosher, but I can't say everything. But in terms of Shabbos, so this may sound funny. The rules in our house were, well, you're not allowed to cook foods on Shabbos, but the ones that were already cooked, you could warm up, so you warm them up by turning the fires on and off, which, from a strict point of view, is probably worse than cooking them. But she was very, very firm that candles had to be lit every Friday night. It wasn't Friday night if the candles weren't lit. But if you weren't ready quite when the sun set, you did it when you were ready, and sometimes it could be an hour or two after it was already dark. But those candles had to be lit. And the funniest one of all, at least to me, and I've told this story a number of times and gotten a lot of laughs out of it, is there were certain things on Shabbos that we weren't allowed to do. We weren't allowed to write anything. We weren't allowed to even tear a piece of paper. And we had to go to shul on Shabbos morning. But once the afternoon came and we were done with lunch, then we could go shopping or do whatever we want. But, and here's the punchline, that if we went shopping on Shabbos afternoon, we had to carry enough cash because we couldn't sign checks or credit card slips. Can you imagine that? Okay. Mom always regretted not having a better Jewish education. She had a Talmud Torah education from a little bit after school and on Sundays. She wished she had better fluency in Hebrew. She had a basic vocabulary but couldn't really put together sentences. And it was very important to her to provide Bob and me with an extensive day school education. And at great financial sacrifice, she did that. And was very proud that our Jewish knowledge exceeded her own. Which leads to the second of the four major topics that I was going to talk about, her value that she put on education and knowledge. She valued education, not just for her family, just as a general concept. And she put her money where her mouth was. I remember very clearly one election day when she came up after voting. And she talked about how she voted for some kind of measure that would have increased her property taxes in order to fund public education. And she very proudly said that she voted for it, even though it's the kind of thing that a lot of people are reluctant to vote for. She was proud of her master's degree from Columbia. She felt that every generation in a family should have more education than the previous generation, and she lived up to that by getting her master's degree. And she always wanted her kids to surpass her and get PhDs, and talked about that to us, probably before we were even in high school, and certainly long before we went to college. And she got her wish. We both have PhDs. I'm not sure, frankly, whether we would have been inclined to do that without her pushing and her influence. We might have done it anyway, just because we're both very academically inclined. But it's certainly possible that my mother's influence is something that actually caused that to happen. She underestimated her own academic ability. She always claimed that other students were smarter than she was, but she compensated by working hard. Anybody that can get a graduate degree from a school like Columbia doesn't have to apologize for their intellect. but that's the way she felt. Maybe she was just being modest, but I really think that that's the way she did feel. And she certainly did work hard on everything that she endeavored to do, including something as mundane as the housework. I mean, she was working essentially full-time and then came home to the house, and she was a real night owl because she used to stay up late at night almost every night to get done with, whatever had to be done, the laundry, sewing, whatever it was that needed to be done. And she worked hard at it. She very often preached the mantra that knowledge is wonderful for the sake of knowledge. It doesn't have to be useful for anything. You don't have to make a living out of it. She was always eager to learn any obscure fact about almost anything. One example of that is that she wanted me to take Latin as my foreign language in high school. That's one of the many times that I didn't listen to her. And I said I wanted to take a language that was more practically useful, and I did. But it's representative of the kind of thing she valued about education. In her adulthood, she and my father took many adult education courses at various local colleges for no credit, just to learn things about every topic under the sun. And I have to take a minute to tell you one really amusing story about one of the adult education courses they took. This story happened to be told to me by my father rather than my mother. But he was saying that one of the times that they were attending one of these adult education college courses, I think it was at St. John's University, but it could have been a different university, but that's not important. But they misread a parking sign and wound up parking where they weren't supposed to park and got a ticket from the campus police. And my father looked at the ticket and it said, if you don't pay this fine, you will not get your grades. And my father said he looked at that great big threat and decided to take the risk. So, my mother's thirst for knowledge stood her very well in her profession as a substitute teacher in New York City high schools. Most substitute teachers wait for a call every morning from this school or that school or the other school. We need a teacher this morning, can you come in? My mother had a totally different arrangement. She worked full-time practically at this school called Grover Cleveland High School. She went in there every morning without being called. And the deal she had with them was the only time they would send her home is if there were no teachers absent in the whole school. Otherwise, if there was one job, she would get the first one. Why was she entitled to that? She was entitled to it because every single teacher in the school wanted her as a substitute if they were absent. And why is that? Well, we've all gone to school. We've all experienced substitute teachers, and 99% of the time they just fill time and don't do anything to advance the curriculum. With my mother's great value that she put on very broad-based knowledge, she would pick up the lesson plan of just about any class that she walked into. And keep in mind, this was high school level, not elementary school. And she would pick it up and she would actually teach whatever was planned, whether it was English, history, some other kind of social studies, even math and science, French. I mentioned French because her teaching license says she was a French teacher, but she almost never taught any French. So she essentially did the same job as any full-time teacher, even though she was officially a substitute. She went into the same school every day, but the only difference was she didn't get any pension. And you might think that that was a foolish decision that she made. Why would she do the same job as everybody else and they're all getting a pension and she's not getting one? It's a really big financial sacrifice she made. So why did she do it? Well, that leads me to the third major topic out of the four, her family. My father obviously was the true love of her life. They were married for 63 years before he died 5 years ago. Whenever she discovered anything unexpected, she right away wanted to share it with my father. I remember very frequently there were chants in the house of, Milton, all excited. She would find something in a magazine or an article and she wanted to share it with him. I've already mentioned her devotion to her mother, so I won't say any more about that. But as far as her choice of job and why she gave up the pension, it was out of devotion to her children. She wanted the freedom, unlike a non-substitute teacher, to say, I'm not coming in today. It only happened about 3 or 4 times a year. But what were the 3 or 4 times a year? Well, one of her kids was in a school play, or there were parent-teacher conferences or something, and she wanted the freedom to skip out of work to do anything that her kids needed, which, I don't think I appreciated it at the time, but now I certainly do. And her love for her sons meshed perfectly with her value for education, because she put a lot of effort into supporting our education. We already said that was part of her decision for her own job choice. And we talked about the financial sacrifice she made to send us to Jewish day schools. It extended even to college. Unlike 99% of parents, she paid the full tuition for Bob and me at some of the best private universities in the country. And she wanted us to have the best possible education that we could get and not have any student debt after it was all through, so that we could get a terrific start in life. And this is something, Bob, I don't think you know this. She even volunteered to continue that through graduate school for me. I didn't accept, but the situation was that when I applied to graduate school, I got into the school that I eventually wound up going to, and they offered me a scholarship like they do with most graduate students. And then there was a school that I had a slight preference for. I thought the education might be slightly better, but I didn't think it was a huge difference. And they accepted me, but they didn't offer me any scholarship money. And right away my mother said to me, if you think you'll get a better education, we'll pay for it. And this is after paying God knows how much for college. I didn't accept the offer, as I said. I thought that the school giving me the scholarship was almost as good, and I saw no reason to put that additional burden on my parents' finances. But the fact that the offer was made really says a lot about who my mother was. The last major topic is her travel and vacations. Even her trips reflected very, very strongly upon her priorities for both time with the family and her emphasis on education. Every vacation was an educational experience. She would have been very unhappy spending a vacation sitting on the beach in Florida, which I know a lot of people would think that's a very nice thing to do. And in fact, in her retirement, when large numbers of her friends were moving away from New York City and buying houses in Florida, she said, that's not for me. I'm not going to move there. I want to be here in New York City with this local culture and everything that she was interested in. She took forever, at almost every vacation we took. Well, that might be an exaggeration. A lot of the vacations we took, we went into one or more museums. And she would take forever to go through a museum. She would stop to read and absorb the contents of every sign on every exhibit. And, this is what turned her on. Then, when we were young, we took a family car trip every year in the first week of January. We were gone for about a week. And we missed a week of school. Well, for my mother to pull us out of a week of school, the value that she placed on school, you would think that this was something she wouldn't want to do. And she told me any number of times during these vacations, the school is not happy about me pulling you out, but I'm doing it because I think that you will learn more during this week with the family, whatever they were doing, than you would have learned in school. And she wanted me to make sure to understand that we weren't going away solely to have a good time. We did have a good time. We enjoyed it quite a bit, but it was very important to her that these vacations be educational. She kept a daily journal of every trip. I don't know why, but when it was a car trip, at the end of for each day, she would mark down the starting and ending odometer mileage on the car, and what we saw that day, and if we had a guide, the guide said a bunch of things about whatever it is we were looking at, and she made sure to write it all down that night, because if she didn't write it down that night, she might forget. And she didn't refer to these journals all that often, but they also weren't dead and buried forever. There were occasions when she was trying to remember the name of some city or some historian or some event, and she would dig through these journals and scrapbooks of her trips that had pictures and various other things, and she would be very happy. Aha! That was the name of the thing I was looking for. And after Bob and I moved out of the house and we were adults and self-sufficient, and they weren't spending many tens of thousands of dollars every year on college tuitions, then my parents really became world travelers, and they were frequently abroad, and there's hardly anywhere in the world that they didn't go, with only a little bit of exaggeration. Besides going to Israel many times and being almost everywhere in the United States, the vacations they took included, just to name a few that come off the top of my memory, they went to Antarctica, they went on an African safari, they took a trip to China, various parts of South America, Australia, New Zealand, Galapagos Islands, Papua New Guinea, and they even went to Vietnam and Cambodia. That's one of the last places they went to before their health declined and they weren't that equipped to travel that much. And wherever they went, they brought home lots of souvenirs and mementos depicting the cultures and the histories of the places they had visited. And Bob and I both wish we knew the stories behind tons of knickknacks that were in their cabinet, that some of them have already been thrown away, but it would have been nice if we had known all about everything about them that my parents did. And another thing about their trips is that their Jewishness was one of the themes of almost every vacation. Everywhere they went, part of the vacation was devoted to learning about the Jewish community and wherever they were. The current community, if one existed, and if not, the past history, and they made sure to visit all of the Jewish landmarks everywhere that they went. And the collection of these scrapbooks never stopped, even when they started taking these more exotic vacations. And the collection of these scrapbooks is so immense that it will be really interesting to see what happens to it all now that my mother is gone. All of these vacations made her feel young and active and vibrant, even when she wasn't so young anymore. And I'll conclude with one incident that happened on one of our vacations, and I don't even remember where, but we were traveling someplace and we were visiting some institution that was close to closing time. And there was one section of it that my mother really wanted to see. And we took a route towards that section, and we were blocked by a fountain that had a continuous water stream on both sides of it. And apparently we had taken the wrong route. And if we turned all the way around and went back through the building, it probably would have been closed and we wouldn't have gotten to see what we wanted to see. And my mother said, "This fountain is not going to stop me. Let's jump over it." And she helped Bob and me and my father, and we all jumped over this thing of water that wasn't meant to be jumped over. And we got to see whatever it was that we had to see. And for a number of years after that, not constantly, of course, but occasionally, she would say something like, "You're as young as you feel, and I jump over fountains, and I'll always be young." And so despite the too many years at the end that she spent in the nursing home as essentially an invalid, both physically and mentally, the lasting image of my mother that I will always retain in my head is her joy over her penchant for doing daring things like jumping over fountains.